My son and his wife thought I was just a frail old woman they could trick into signing away my home. They saw me as a burden, someone to be managed and discarded when I was no longer useful. For months, they isolated me in my own house, controlling my life, all while secretly planning to use my home to pay off their own debts. The disrespect was staggering. But they made one critical mistake. They didn't know I had a secret of my own, a single piece of paper hidden for 30 years that would give me the most satisfying justice and leave them with absolutely nothing. For the longest time, my Sundays were a comfort. The whole house would fill with the smell of pot roast, the way it did when my Frank was still alive. I'd sit in my armchair, the one with the permanent indent shaped just for me, and I'd have my knitting in my lap, the soft weight of the Afghan on my knees, a familiar friend. But lately, that comfort had been replaced by a quiet, humming tension. I watched my son Jason standing over the roast. His shoulders had this permanent slump to them, a weariness that had settled deep into his bones and had nothing to do with a long work week. And then there was his wife Samantha. She was a whirlwind of motion and bright, brittle smiles that never, ever reached her eyes. She'd flutter around the table, arranging and rearranging the silverware, and I could feel her gaze on me lingering just a second too long before darting away. It was a look I couldn't quite decipher, but it made the fine hairs on my arms stand up. For the past month, her new project was me. It all started after a dizzy spell I had while gardening. Just a moment of lightheadedness, but for Samantha, it was an opportunity. Suddenly, my well-being was her full-time job. She was always asking if I had enough iced tea, telling me I had to stay hydrated, her voice just a little too loud, a little too cheerful. My phone calls became her business. If a friend from church called, Samantha would answer and politely explain that I was resting. My mail started appearing on my nightstand, already opened. "Just to help you keep things organized." "Ruth," she'd say. When Mrs. Gable from next door popped over with some of her famous zucchini bread, Samantha met her at the door, draped a protective arm around my shoulders, and told her, "We just didn't want me getting overwhelmed." It was a masterful performance, this show of a loving, concerned daughter-in-law. But from the inside, it felt less like a hug and more like a cage, gilded with kindness, but a cage all the same. The real betrayal, the moment the lock on that cage clicked shut, happened on a Tuesday morning. The air was still cool, and the kitchen was filled with the smell of coffee. Samantha sat me down at the table and spread a fan of papers in front of me. Her pen clicked a fast, nervous rhythm against the wood. She explained that they were just some Medicare updates things that needed a signature. Then she slid one particular document forward, tapping a perfectly manicured finger on a dense block of tiny print. She told me this one was just a formality, a simple paper, so Jason could talk to the bank for me to manage my accounts if I ever got sick. She kept repeating that it was to protect me. My eyesight isn't what it used to be. The words swam together into an incomprehensible blur of legalese. But I trusted my son. I've always trusted Jason. I looked over at him, expecting a nod, a reassuring smile. Instead, he was staring so hard into his coffee cup, you'd think the secrets of the universe were swirling in there. His jaw was a tight, hard line. He wouldn't meet my eyes. A small, cold knot of unease formed in my stomach, but I pushed it down. This was my family. They loved me. I picked up the pen and signed where Samantha's finger pointed. My own signature, a swirl of letters I'd written 1,000,000 times, looked foreign and wrong on that page. The truth didn't stay hidden for long. On Friday, I was walking down the hall toward my room for my afternoon nap when I heard Samantha's voice coming from the kitchen. It wasn't her usual bright, cheerful tone. This was a low, panicked hiss, a sound I'd never heard from her before. I stopped my hand freezing on the doorknob. She was on the phone. I heard her say she didn't care what some man named Mark had said, that the business was gone. She said they only had until the end of the month before the bank started proceedings. My heart started to pound in my chest. Then came the words that made the blood run cold in my veins. There was a pause, and she whispered, "No, they hadn't told me. They had another way. An asset was being secured. They just needed a little more time." I heard the sharp click of the phone being hung up, followed by a single choked sob. The silence that followed was deafening. An asset. A deadline. The words echoed in my mind, and that cold knot in my stomach turned to a solid block of ice. I looked down at my hands, at the fingers that had held the pen just 3 days earlier. And in that awful, clarifying moment, I understood. I was the asset, and I had just handed my own family the key to my destruction. By the way, if you're enjoying the story so far, please consider subscribing so you don't miss what's next. We'd also love to hear your own story if you'd like to share it with our community. Now, let's get back to it. I spent the rest of that weekend in a state of cold, quiet clarity. The shock from overhearing that phone call had settled into something hard and heavy in my chest. Betrayal is a bitter pill, and I had swallowed it whole. I knew that going directly to Samantha would be pointless. She would just spin a web of denials and feigned concern, twisting my words until I was the confused old woman she wanted me to be. No, my target had to be Jason, my son. He was the weak link in their little conspiracy, and I could see the guilt eating him alive. It was a festering wound, and I knew I had to probe it. I waited until Sunday evening. Samantha was in the living room on a video call with her sister, her loud, forced laughter echoing through the house. I found Jason on the back porch, just as I knew I would be. He was sitting in one of the old wicker chairs, staring out at the lawn he and his father used to take such pride in. Now it was just another chore he no longer had the heart for. The chair groaned when I sat down beside him, and he startled. I kept my voice soft, deceptively casual. I told him I'd been thinking about Mr. Abernathy, that nice man from the bank who helped his father and me set up our will all those years ago. I said I was just wondering if the man Samantha had us use for those papers last Tuesday was from the same firm. It was such a simple, innocent-sounding question, but it was a carefully laid trap. Frank and I never used a firm. Our lawyer was a solo practitioner who had passed away 5 years ago. Jason knew that. Panic flashed in his eyes, a flicker of pure terror. He flinched as if my words had physically struck him. He stammered that no, it was a different group, a specialist. He was always a terrible liar. He couldn't look at me, his gaze fixed on a little crack in the concrete patio. At that moment, Samantha's call must have ended because she appeared in the doorway, her smile faltering as she took in the scene. She wanted to know what the two of us were talking about, her eyes darting between her husband's guilty face and my calm one. I told her evenly that I was just asking about the lawyer she used for the papers. Her relief was visible. She jumped in immediately, saying of course it was Thompson and Associates, naming a big firm from a billboard on the highway. She added that they were the best. But Jason, not hearing her answer, was still trying to salvage his own lie. He mumbled something about it being Miller Financial Services. The contradiction was so stark, so clumsy, it hung in the air between them like a physical thing. They stared at each other for a long moment, their shared story collapsing right in front of me. The heat that radiated from them wasn't from the evening sun. It was a wave of pure guilt and fear. I knew then, with absolute certainty, that I was in a fight. The next afternoon, I waited until Samantha left for the grocery store. I went straight to the old secretary desk in my bedroom, a piece of furniture she never bothered to dust. Tucked away in the back of a drawer was a worn leather address book. My hands trembled just slightly as I found the number I was looking for, one I hadn't called in years. A kind, familiar voice answered on the second ring. I identified myself as Ruth Miller and apologized for bothering him, but I told him I needed his help. I told him I thought I was in terrible trouble. David Peterson, a retired attorney, and my late husband's oldest friend just listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't question me. And his patient silence was the most comforting sound I had ever heard. I finally had an ally. When Samantha returned an hour later, the entire atmosphere in the house had shifted. The air of phony concern was gone, replaced by a tense, oppressive watchfulness. She started following me from room to room. She no longer left me alone in the house, not even for a minute. When the phone would ring, she would snatch it up and tell whoever was on the other end that I was resting and couldn't be disturbed. The gilded cage was shrinking, the bars growing colder and harder. And I understood with a chilling clarity that this was no longer just about my house. It was about my freedom. After our confrontation on the porch, I knew I had to make a strategic retreat. A cornered animal is a dangerous one, and I had cornered them both. The next morning, for the first time in years, I didn't come down for breakfast. I stayed in my room, and when Samantha came to check on me, I told her I had a terrible headache and felt awfully tired. Later, when a friend from my church group called, I made sure my voice was frail and weak. Samantha stood in the doorway of my bedroom, listening to every word, and I could see an expression of grim satisfaction on her face. A sick, compliant old woman was exactly what she needed me to be. The panic I had caused them subsided, replaced by a dangerous, arrogant confidence. They had the power of attorney. They thought they had control. As I lay there pretending to be weak, my mind was racing. I tried to piece together how it all happened. I didn't have to imagine it, not really. I knew my son. I could just picture him 6 months ago standing in the empty shell of his business, J. Miller and Sons Contracting. A name he took to honor his father now, just a sign on a building full of debt and failure. I imagined the phone call from the bank about a second loan one he probably took out without telling. Samantha convinced that one big job would fix everything. But it didn't. I could see him coming home, the weight of it all, crushing him, finally confessing to his wife that everything was gone. I could feel Samantha's shock turning into a cold, pragmatic terror as she realized they stood to lose it all, their house, their cars, their children's future. The shame must have been suffocating. And I can see her in that moment of shared desperation, her gaze falling on the framed photo of me on the mantel. A terrible practical idea forming in her mind, born not of pure malice, but of a frantic, clawing need to survive. I could almost hear her whisper it, her justification for the nightmare she was about to create my house was paid off. But I wasn't just lying in bed feeling sorry for myself. While Samantha believed I was napping, I was on a quiet mission. David's advice had been simple. I needed proof that I was the rightful owner, something that predated the paper I had signed. In the back of my closet, tucked beneath a stack of heavy quilts my own mother had made, was my husband's old metal lockbox. It was heavy, and my hands shook as I dragged it out. I didn't have the key, but a silver letter opener and a good deal of determination worked just as well. I pried the lid open with a groan of protesting metal. Inside, beneath old war medals and my children's birth certificates, was a folded, yellowed document. The original deed to the house. It was dated 30 years ago, and the names on it, Frank and Ruth Miller, were as clear as day. I held my weapon in my hands. I took out the old smartphone one of my grandchildren had insisted I get snapped a clear photo of the deed and sent it to David with a simple 2-word message, "Found it." A week went by. My act of being frail and defeated worked better than I could have hoped. Samantha, now fully convinced of her victory, grew careless. One night, I came downstairs for a glass of water. The house was dark and silent. There, on the kitchen counter, left out in plain sight, was a bank statement. It wasn't their personal account. It was for the failed business. I picked it up. The final balance was a staggering negative number, a figure with so many zeros it made my head spin. But the number itself didn't matter. This piece of paper was the proof. It was the tangible, undeniable motive for everything they had done to me. I took out my phone again, the little screen glowing in the dark kitchen. I took a photo of the statement, every last incriminating digit, and sent that to David as well. The trap was now set. All I had to do was wait for the right moment to spring it. After a week of biding my time, the day finally came. David and I had a plan, and it was set to begin at precisely 10 o'clock on a Wednesday morning. I was in my room fully dressed in a navy blue suit I hadn't worn in years when I heard the doorbell ring. Downstairs, I could hear Samantha's annoyed sigh. She hated interruptions to her morning routine. I stood at the top of the stairs, my heart beating a steady, determined rhythm, and listened. I heard the door open, and then a man's voice, calm and firm. It was David. He introduced himself and said he was here to speak with his client, Ruth Miller. Samantha's voice was tight with false concern when she replied. She told him I wasn't feeling well, that I couldn't have visitors. That was her first mistake. I heard David say that it was all right, and then the sound of his footsteps in the entryway. He told her he had a court order that said I absolutely could have visitors. That's when I made my move. I walked to the landing so they could see me. I stood there straight and tall, looking down at Samantha, whose face had gone deathly pale. She stared up at me, at the suit I was wearing, at the resolute look on my face, and in that moment, the entire power dynamic in the house shifted with the force of an earthquake. She stammered and turned to Jason, who had come out of the kitchen, his face a mask of pure dread. She wanted to know what was happening. David didn't give me a chance to answer. He walked calmly to the coffee table, placed his leather briefcase on it, and clicked open the locks. He told them what this was about. He pulled out a paper and slid it across the table. It was a copy, he explained, of the original deed to this house registered in the names of Ruth and Frank Miller. Then he pulled out a second paper. This one, he said, was a copy of a power of attorney they had me sign under false pretenses, which they would be contending was fraudulent. The carefully constructed facade Samantha had built around herself didn't just crack. It shattered into a million pieces. She stared at the deed, then back up at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and a strange sort of betrayal, as if I were the one who had wronged her. She whispered my name, and then she just broke. The torrent of fear and shame she'd been bottling up for months erupted. She started crying, telling me I didn't understand. The whole desperate, pathetic story came tumbling out: the failed business, the crushing debt, the terror of having to tell their friends and neighbors that they had lost everything. She sobbed that the bank was going to take it all, that they had no choice, that using my house was the only way to save their family. She collapsed onto the sofa, the full, ugly weight of her hidden history finally exposed to the light. The confession hit my son like a physical blow. He stared at his wife, then at me, the silent accomplice finally forced to look at the wreckage his silence had caused. The conspiracy between them fractured right there in our living room, leaving nothing but two separate people drowning in their own shame. I walked slowly down the stairs, my hand gripping the banister, my gaze never leaving Samantha. I was no longer the frail, confused old woman she needed me to be. When I spoke, my voice was quiet, but it carried the immense weight of my reclaimed authority. I told her that she did have a choice, that you always have a choice, and now I was going to make mine. I looked over at David, and he gave me a slight, steady nod. The immediate threat was over. I was in control now, and my son and daughter-in-law were left powerless on my sofa, utterly terrified of the consequences that were sure to come. My choice was not one made in anger. It was a decision forged in the quiet, lonely nights of the past few weeks, a conclusion reached after a lifetime of sacrifice, was met with betrayal. The final reckoning didn't happen in my living room, the scene of their breakdown. David insisted it take place on neutral ground. We met in the conference room of his downtown law office a few days later. It was a sterile, intimidating space paneled in dark wood that seemed to absorb all the sound. A long, polished mahogany table stretched between us, a silent, impartial witness. I sat at one end with David dressed in the same simple navy suit. At the far end, Samantha and Jason sat huddled together, looking small and washed out under the harsh fluorescent lights, their defeat clinging to them like a shroud. I didn't say a word. I didn't have to. I let David do the work. He was magnificent. His voice was a calm, methodical drumbeat of facts in the quiet room. He systematically laid out the entire case not as a story, but as a series of undeniable truths. He formally presented the original deed clear and irrefutable. He presented the fraudulently obtained power of attorney. And finally, he presented the bank statement from the failed business, the one Samantha had so carelessly left on my counter, which laid bare the desperate motive for their deception. With each document that was placed on the polished table, I saw Samantha flinch. I saw Jason seem to shrink further and further into his chair, as if trying to disappear completely. The judgment, when it came, wasn't delivered with a gavel or a shout. It was delivered in David's quiet, authoritative voice. He stated simply that the power of attorney was void. He explained that any actions they had taken with it were illegal, and that an attempt to secure a loan against my property, which they were clearly planning, would have constituted felony bank fraud. The words just hung there in the heavy air, cold and unforgiving. But I knew the true punishment wasn't the threat of jail time. It was the crushing weight of having their ugly secret truth exposed in this formal public way. All the lies they told themselves and each other were dismantled piece by piece, leaving nothing behind but the quiet, devastating finality of the law. Then it was my turn to speak. I reached into my purse and pulled out a single crisp white envelope. I slid it across the vast expanse of the mahogany table. It seemed to take forever to reach them. My voice was steady when I told them what it was. A formal eviction notice. They had 30 days to vacate my house. Jason finally looked up at me, his eyes pleading, and he started to beg me, his voice cracking on the word, Mom. Samantha shot him a look of pure venom before her face crumpled into a mask of desperate appeal. She cried that they had nowhere to go, that they would lose everything. I looked right at her, my voice firm but not cruel. I told her that she had lost everything the moment she decided my dignity was a price she was willing to pay. I stood up. Then my part in this was over. I explained that what they did now was their choice. The consequences they were facing were the ones they had created for themselves. I didn't lecture them. I didn't condemn them further. I simply reclaimed what was mine and set a firm, unbreakable boundary. David and I walked out of the conference room, leaving my son and my daughter-in-law to stare at the eviction notice on the table. The silence we left behind was the most damning verdict of all. The 30 days that followed the meeting in David's office were the quietest and loudest month I have ever lived through. The house, which had been filled with so much tension and false cheer, was now heavy with the suffocating silence of shame. There were no arguments, no pleas, just the sound of packing tape being pulled from a roll and the muffled thud of boxes being filled. We were like ghosts, haunting the same space, careful to never make eye contact, never crossing paths in the hallway. I spent most of my time in the garden. When the moving truck finally pulled away, leaving them in a small, cramped rental apartment across town, the quiet it left behind was a relief. The news of what happened rippled through our little community, not like a loud explosion, but like a slow-moving fog. There was no public scandal, just a series of hushed conversations, withdrawn dinner invitations, and a sudden social chill that I know was more isolating for them than any public outcry could have been. In the months that followed, their paths went in very different directions. My son Jason, stripped of all his pride, began a slow, painful journey toward accountability. He got a job working for another contractor, a man he used to compete with. I can only imagine how much shame he had to swallow each morning just to put on his tool belt and go to work. He started calling me once a week, always on a Sunday evening. The conversations were stilted and awkward, filled with halting apologies that I would politely accept, but not absolve him of. He was beginning to understand that his true failure wasn't as a businessman, but as a son. Samantha, however, remained trapped in a prison of her own bitterness. From what little Jason would say, she blamed me, she blamed him, she blamed the economy, she blamed everyone but herself. The shame she felt didn't humble her. It curdled into a permanent simmering rage. As for me, I thrived. The quiet in my house was no longer oppressive. It was peaceful. The air felt lighter. I reconnected with my friends from the church group. I joined the community garden and found a surprising joy in having my hands in the dirt. My home, once a cage, became a place of warmth, again filled with the chatter of old friends over tea. And then I had an idea. I thought about the name of Jason's failed business, J. Miller and Sons, and I decided to repurpose it. With a small loan and some legal help from David, I turned my home into the Haven House. 2 other ladies from my church, both widows who had been struggling with loneliness and the upkeep of their own homes, moved in with me. We share the expenses, the chores, and the companionship. I had lost one family, but I had created a new one built not on blood or obligation, but on a foundation of mutual respect and shared values. A year after the eviction, on a beautiful sunny Sunday afternoon, I was sitting on my back porch. It was no longer a place of silent dread, but was filled with the easy laughter of my housemates as we played a game of cards. And my son Jason was there. He was sitting quietly on the steps, having just finished mowing my lawn. It was something he had offered to do, a small, weekly act of service. It was the first time I had invited him to stay for a glass of iced tea afterward, the first time he had been inside the house in a year. He looked over at me, and for the first time in a very long time, I felt like he was truly seeing me, not as a burden, not as a resource, but as a woman who was strong and whole on her own. I smiled at him, a genuine, peaceful smile. The legacy I was building now wasn't one of quiet sacrifice and sorrow. It was one of dignity and strength. And the house stood behind me, no longer a cage, but a testament to a legacy reclaimed. In the end, Ruth's story teaches a profound lesson about the nature of justice. Her victory was not simply in reclaiming her home, but in understanding the deep, desperate fear that had driven her son and daughter-in-law to betray her. She learned that true strength isn't found in crushing those who have wronged you, but in holding them accountable for their actions, while still recognizing the human weakness that caused their failure. Her greatest triumph wasn't the silence they left behind, but the joyful life she built in its place, proving that a true legacy is one of dignity.